The latest reports indicate that Putin is moving in and the invasion into Ukraine is underway. At least that's what the consensus is in mainstream media. That is what you're likely to see online as well. And this follows news indicating that Putin is ordering troops into two separatist regions of eastern Ukraine known as Donbas, while also declaring them as independent states. Now, Ukraine has declared a state of emergency in response to this, and President Joe Biden has implemented some new sanctions that are supposed to be targeted toward Russian oligarchs. Now, here is a snippet of Joe Biden's speech responding to Putin's latest actions.
Setting up a rationale to take more territory by force, in my view. And if we listened to his speech last night, and many of you did, I know, he's setting up a rationale to go much further. This is the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, as he indicated and asked permission to be able to do from his Duma.
From his Duma. Now, Russia has evacuated its embassy in Kyiv, and Ukraine has also urged its citizens to immediately leave Russia. Also, the Associated Press is reporting that a senior US defense official in Washington said that the Russian forces arrayed along Ukraine's border are as ready as they can be for an invasion, with about 80% of them in what the US considers forward positions ready to go within 3 to 30 miles of the border. The official, who spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive information, added that, quote, "We still cannot confirm that Russian forces have moved into the Donbas area." I think that's an important part of the story that I think gets lost in the mix if you're watching on cable news or if you're reading a lot of these legacy media outlets. And for anyone who is hoping that there's still a path forward in a more diplomatic fashion, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has announced that he has canceled his meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. That was supposed to take place tomorrow, and those talks are apparently not going to happen anymore, which is concerning because we clearly want this to be de-escalated. We want to move forward in a more diplomatic way, but it doesn't seem like that is likely. Now, there's a lot going on. It's kind of difficult to figure out who to believe, who not to believe, who's reporting this accurately. And to help us kind of cut through some of the nonsense, I've brought on Derek Davison, who is the host of the American Prestige podcast, which I highly, highly recommend that you all check out and subscribe to. It's the podcast that he hosts along with a friend of the show, Daniel Bessner. And Derek, I'm grateful for you to take the time to speak with us today. Thanks for coming on.
Sure, thanks for having me.
So let's get started with, well, first, let me just say, it's really hard to figure out what is and isn't happening because the people that we unfortunately rely on to report what's going on tweet things like this. So I want to go to this tweet from Julia Ioffe, and she put this out there. Her work can be found everywhere, Atlantic, New York Magazine. She tweets, "This is one of the fundamental differences between American and Russian political culture. As much as the American political system gets crap for being pro-war, it's actually allergic to the thing, thus drone wars, as if drone wars aren't war.
They're not war.
They're not war.
They don't count.
Yeah. The Russian system is not scared of war, it welcomes it." So when these are the kinds of people that are reporting the news, I have a tough time taking anything that they write or report seriously. So with that said, what is going on? What is the latest news in regard to Putin's actions in Ukraine?
So, I mean, what he's done so far, I think you could characterize as an invasion of a kind. The fact that the US government can't actually confirm that they've moved peacekeepers, as the Russians are calling it, quote unquote peacekeepers, into the Donbas is interesting. That suggests things are a little bit even less developed than a lot of the reporting has suggested. But if they do move in, and I would expect that they will, they do move in some number of forces to the Donbas to serve as peacekeepers or occupy the territory, whatever you want to call it. I think we can say that that's an invasion of internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, but it's not the nightmare scenario that people have been, the Biden administration and the British government and other sources have been kind of talking about for several weeks now, with sieges and kill lists and tanks, lines of tanks going into Kyiv and all of these things. We're not at that stage. We may never get to that stage. I don't want to completely foreclose on the possibility, but that's not what it looks like is happening right now.
Now, for some portion of the left, and I consider myself part of this group, I think we get painted as individuals who try to serve as apologists for Putin. I do not think that's true at all. I think that everyone wants to avoid, Russia invading Ukraine, but you can maybe approach that in a more diplomatic way instead of kind of escalating both the rhetoric and the actions in this conflict. And so you have US officials claiming that they've been approaching this in a diplomatic way. And my read of that has been, no, that's not actually true, but I could be wrong. So what is your read? What have you noticed in terms of how the Biden administration has approached this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I would say they've approached it primarily through the lens of threat inflation. And I think what they think they're doing on some level is closing off options for the Russians by revealing all of this supposed intelligence that they have about these terrible things that the Russians are planning to do, which to my mind is one of the reasons that it's been difficult to really assess what's going on and cut through the media chatter. Is the media has just sort of dutifully reported all of these things as though it were happily functioning as an arm of the US intelligence community, which I think is a very dangerous thing, and has made it really difficult to parse what's actually happening versus what they're kind of helpfully parroting out. I would say that they have engaged in the appearance of diplomacy. I mean, you certainly had meetings between Blinken and Sergei Lavrov. You've had meetings, phone calls between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin. You've had this exchange of responses to, the Russians put out a few weeks ago a list of security demands, some of them a little, beyond the pale or far-fetched. The US responded to that, and then the Russians responded to that. You've had this exchange of documents, but I don't think there's been a real effort to try and find any common ground or find any place that you could open up a channel for actual discussions that would ratchet tensions down. There's sort of been like an airing of grievances, or like, we hear you, but the answer is no, without kind of an actual creative diplomatic effort to talk and try to hash out some of the issues that the Russians have put forward.
So let's put everything in some context, some historical context, because Russia claims that, the reason why it's acting the way it is because it feels that, Ukraine joining NATO would be a threat to their national security. And a lot of people kind of brush that off and dismiss it as if it's ridiculous, that is not a credible claim to make. I have actually given some credibility to that statement, considering what the whole intention of NATO was in the first place, considering that Ukraine shares a border with Russia, considering, NATO having this big meeting in 2008, where they had passed a resolution to allow both Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. And we saw how Russia responded to that. Russia responded with aggression toward Georgia because it's a big red line for them, for these countries to join NATO. But do you feel that these are legitimate security concerns for Russia? Or do you think that Putin is just using it as an excuse to kind of pave the way for aggression toward Ukraine?
I don't. I mean, I think that there are legitimate issues here, legitimate Russian security concerns. We can go back to the 90s, the decision, first of all, to leave NATO intact at the end of the Cold War. This was an explicitly Cold War institution. The decision to not say, okay, the Cold War's over, it's time to move on to something else. And then the decision after that to expand NATO to Eastern Europe against what I think by most credible accounts were promises that were made to first Mikhail Gorbachev and then Boris Yeltsin around the time that the Soviet Union collapsed, that NATO would be much more judicious about expanding into territory that had previously been, let's say, part of the Warsaw Pact. We can move to, there are a couple of accounts that you can find, credible accounts again, I think, one from a former Secretary General of NATO, that Russia explored the idea of joining NATO, that they brought this up. Putin himself, when he was first president, or in his early kind of early days as president in 2001, hinted that he would like to bring Russia into NATO, and was told no. And I think that in itself, kind of, when you have this organization whose motto is pretty much anybody can join, and you tell Russia, no, I'm sorry, you can't come in, that gives away the game. That kind of lets the cat out of the bag of what this organization exists to do. And then, yeah, as you say, you can go all the way to the 2008 Bucharest summit, which was the summit where really the Bush administration really strong-armed, I think, the rest of NATO into making this pledge that Ukraine and Georgia would both be basically guaranteed membership when they were ready. And yeah, it's been a series of provocations, moves closer to Russia in places that would be really vital security interests from a Russian perspective to have, let's say, US or UK or Western military forces staged in those countries.
So a lot of the media coverage and a lot of the narrative coming from the Biden White House and the State Department is that, well, look, Putin just wants to take over Ukraine. That's what this is about. This is Russian imperialism. And I don't discount the potential of Russian imperialism. However, I do see Putin as a rational actor, and I would argue that his economic interests probably outweigh any interests in taking over Ukraine. I could be wrong. So as a result of what's happening, the deal that Russia previously had with Germany in this Nord Stream 2 pipeline is now put on hold. Obviously, that works against Russia's interests. Russia supplies the European Union about 40% of the fossil fuels necessary. Like, they're very dependent on Russia. So this does kind of pave the way for the US to export more of its oil to these nations. And I'm wondering if that's possibly some of the motivation behind continuing to escalate things with Russia when we should be de-escalating. But I want to understand, what Putin's real intentions are here. Because if you do a cost-benefit analysis, I would just argue that rationally speaking, invading Ukraine, not the way to go if you're looking out for your own personal interests.
Right, so I think there are a couple of layers to this. I mean, there is a sort of Russian nationalist component to Putin's ideology and his, that he's exhibited in his time as Russian president. He did give a speech on Monday evening before he announced that he was going to recognize the independence of the two republics. That called into question Ukrainian statehood, like the fundamental sort of underpinnings of Ukrainian statehood. So this is a thing for him. I don't want to discount that entirely. But as you say, there are bigger fish to fry here. There are economic concerns. There are security concerns. I think that primarily sort of the first layer of this is that the Russians have these security concerns about the possibility of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, just like they did with Georgia, just like they did in the 2008 Georgian War. They've now sort of recognized the independence of a couple of the breakaway republics on the territory of Ukraine, on the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, and that enables them to, worst case scenario, just sort of keep Ukraine unbalanced, unstable, and therefore not a great candidate for NATO membership. They really weren't, a candidate for imminent membership anyway. But this, gives Putin a sort of sustained lever to prevent that from happening. I think the other sort of consideration here is that this is a country that feels like, not without reason, it has been humiliated over the last 30 years. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia kind of inherited the history of that country and its mantle as this sort of great power, the second pole of the Cold War global construct. And really they've been reduced in stature quite a bit. And I think, for Putin, this is also about kind of demonstrating that Russia is a great power and doing so in ways that are modeled on things that the United States has done, frankly. I mean, he will go back and did, he cites this fairly regularly, did it in 2008 with respect to the Georgian war, and I think has done it again recently to talk about Ukraine. He'll cite the intervention in Kosovo in 1998 when NATO went in. Similar circumstances, claims of genocide, supporting the independence of a country that had hitherto been internationally recognized as part of another country, and he'll say this is what you guys did. Going into Ukraine like this. He could cite the Iraq war. And basically the message is like, look, I mean, this is what great powers do, and Russia's a great power. You guys do this, like the United States and NATO do this kind of stuff all the time. So I'm just playing in the same sandbox.
What I also find kind of fascinating about everything is how, the United States, the West is pretty obsessed with preventing the international landscape, turning it back into a multipolar, international landscape, right? Right now, the West kind of dominates everything. But with the way the US is handling Russia, I feel like we're kind of pushing Russia in the arms of China. How do you see China factoring in to all of this? Because from what I've seen so far, China's been pretty skeptical with the narrative coming from the US State Department.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Putin visited Beijing early on, and after the Olympics started, he and Xi Jinping had a love fest basically, and talked about their everlasting friendship and the great relationship between these two countries. And I think that's true. Both of them have been kind of shoved together by opposition from the United States or by kind of hostility emanating from the United States. There are limits to that. I mean, I think even over the last few days, you've seen a kind of hands-off response from China. They haven't taken sides overtly here, and China's foreign policy in most parts of the world is rooted in, outside of its own backyard, is rooted in a sort of no problems with anybody philosophy. So I don't think they want to antagonize Ukraine necessarily, or you're just going to follow some of the more maximalist interpretations of the things that Putin has said. So I think they're going to keep their distance. They will probably offer an outlet for the Russians if they're not able to sell gas, or if the Russians decide to stop selling natural gas to Europe altogether, which is a possibility in retaliation for the Nord Stream 2 move. They'll probably try to sell more to China to make up some of that lost revenue. I don't think there are limits, obviously, to how much Russian natural gas China is going to be willing to buy. But I do think these countries have been brought together to some degree. Again, there are limits, but yeah, I think you're right.
And final question for you: how do you see this all playing out? Do you think that there's still a possibility to de-escalate? Or do you think that we're just kind of on this path of escalation, increased tensions, and there's really no end in sight?
So, I mean, I think we're in a pattern now where you're going to see a sanctions kind of tit for tat. You'll see Russia respond to what's already been done, maybe cutting off their gas exports to Europe or limiting them in some way. And then you'll see more waves of sanctions from the West as this kind of goes on. We don't know, and even now the U.S. is sort of, while acknowledging that this isn't the nightmare scenario, they're still kind of hyping this total war, total invasion scenario. They supposedly have warned the Ukrainians that the Russians are going to make a move on the city of Kyiv, which would be a major escalation if it happens. But again, like every other one of these reports, you just don't know. I think there is a window for diplomacy here to stop things where they are now, in a situation where the Russians have recognize these two republics. They are offering aid and support. They may put peacekeepers in, but they may not necessarily need to go any further than that. But you have to actually talk. And as you alluded to earlier, the United States has sort of dusted its hands and said, we're not talking anymore. And Blinken has canceled his meeting with Lavrov. There was supposed to be, there was talk of a summit between Biden and Putin. I assume that's probably off now. So I'm not optimistic about the possibility of diplomacy at this point, because there simply doesn't seem to be any appetite for it on the U.S. side. And on the Russian side, again, it's hard to know what the aim is here. They've said that they're recognizing the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk on the entire territory of both of those provinces as defined by Ukraine, which would mean inevitably some kind of a conflict, because there's a lot of territory in those provinces that the government still controls, that presumably they would intend to take back by force, I guess. But we haven't seen a move in that direction yet. So I think based on that, if the United States would come back to the table and say, let's talk about this, there is an opening where you could freeze things where they are now. But I don't see that appetite from the Biden administration.
Well, we're gonna have to see. Derek Davison, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone go check out American Prestige, an excellent podcast if you're interested in actually learning the historical context of various political, foreign policy issues that we often discuss on this show. Thanks again, I really appreciate it, Derek.
Sure, Anna, thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.